It's your fault our fun got ruined. Dan, now completely overbearing, came at me with some outrageous logic. It's your fault I am unhappy. I'll divorce you and demand property division. He howled hysterically. I was so appalled that I was left speechless. I never imagined that the serious and work-devoted Dan would come to this. The shock was great, but from the day the truth came out, my decision was made. Okay. I muttered, fed up. If you insist, I understand. We'll divorce. You can have this house, so please enjoy your life with her. Really? Dan could not hide his joy. He must be thinking he can now spend carefree time with Mandy, now that I'm out of the way. His shallowness astounds me. He doesn't know that hell awaits. My name is Judy Anderson, I'm 48 years old. My husband, 55, is named Dan. We have one daughter, a college student named Hannah. She's currently living near her university. So, it's just Dan and me at home. Since we are a couple, I'd like to get along well. But that's been a difficult issue. Dan is very taciturn. He hardly responds when spoken to and quickly retreats to his room. There were lonely times, but on the other hand, he was dedicated to his work. From the time we first met, he hasn't changed. I met Dan, who works at a small to medium-sized company, through a friend's introduction. He was very nervous, and I thought to myself, he's not very talkative. It felt somewhat lacking at first, but as a friend had told me he was serious, it seemed he really was dedicated to his work. I found that admirable in him. He wasn't good with women, but he was far better than the frivolous men. A serious, work-devoted person is ultimately the best, I thought. So, I initiated our relationship and then we married. Dan was always sparse with words, but I managed to cover for him, and we've come this far. We were blessed with a child, and had led a plain but peaceful life. Hannah is already a senior in college, and child-rearing is almost over. I thought, let's enjoy our time together as a couple now. That was when it happened. Suddenly, an unexpected event occurred in my life. It was one morning. Dan told me he didn't need dinner because he would be late coming home from going out with a junior at work. I'm going to a concert. I was invited because the junior is a fan. It's not a famous idol or anything. I don't know the name. Oh, that's unusual. Nowadays, they don't say fan. They say fave. I showed off the knowledge I learned from Hannah. Fave? That's a weird word. I don't really get this youth culture. Saying that, Dan left the house without much enthusiasm. It was a usual day, until then. That night, Dan came home late. It was nearly 11 p.m., and I was just about to go to bed. Oh, you are back. How was the concert? I called out to Dan, but he didn't respond. His eyes were vacant, as if his mind was elsewhere. What's wrong, dear? After asking a few times, he finally spoke. Well, I'm going to sleep now. However, he didn't look at me and went straight to the bedroom. He was always not very talkative, but that day, he seemed odd. Maybe he was tired from attending an unfamiliar concert after work. I thought nothing of it at the time. But I started to notice something odd after a while. He began coming home later more frequently, and he started going out on weekends too. When I confronted him, he insisted, I'm busy with work. There had always been busy periods at his company, but it was the first time he was frequently late like this. Also, another change had occurred. It seemed he was spending more money. Hey, can you pay the water bill this month? The first words he had spoken in a long while were about this. Huh? Didn't you just get paid the other day? When I responded suspiciously, he quickly retorted. Can't help it. I've had a lot of work-related outings, and money's tight. I see. I work for my family's business, so unlike a housewife, I'm not without money, but for him to ask me for money. Dan holds a position as section chief at his company, but since it's a small to medium-sized business, his salary isn't very high. However, there had never been a situation where money was short. He doesn't drink or gamble, and he doesn't have expensive hobbies. Yet, the number of times Dan asked for money kept increasing. Each time I asked why, he would only say, "It's necessary for work." Faced with such an explanation, I couldn't help but agree. It was too much trouble to keep handing money over, so I decided to give him a passbook that he used to use, which I had stored away for emergencies. Dan happily accepted the passbook. I thought, something's off. My suspicions grew gradually. Then one day, we received sudden tragic news at home. My father had suddenly passed away. He had collapsed in the bathroom. It was a heart attack. He had suffered a heart condition and collapsed a few years ago, so we were cautious. My mother told me in a somber voice over the phone. I couldn't hide my agitation. It was so sudden that I was left dazed even after hanging up the phone. However, this was not the time to be sentimental. I had to prepare for the funeral. I informed Dan and Hannah about my father via messenger and began getting ready to leave. Hannah, who had rushed over immediately, was also in shock. As the two of us were preparing to head to my family home, Dan returned. "You saw the message, didn't you? We need to prepare for the wake and the funeral. I'm going to help Mom at her house now, so come with me." However, my husband replied in an irritable tone. "Sorry, but I have something else I need to do and can't come." "What? Something for work?" "Even at a time like this, you don't have to work, you could take bereavement leave." "It's something important." I was shocked by his raised voice. I had never seen him like this before. However, I was not convinced. "What is that important? More important than a family member dying?" I can't believe it. Our argument quickly escalated into a huge fight. It seemed insane that he would try to go out at such a time. As he remained stubborn, my anger grew uncontrollable. At that moment, Hannah intervened. "Stop it, both of you. Calm down. We need to help Grandma now." "Yes, you're right, but..." I glanced at Dan. He snorted arrogantly but seemed to resign himself to abandoning whatever he had planned. Grumbling, he reluctantly followed us to my family home. As expected, my mother was flustered and making various calls to arrange things. Hannah and I supported her. Dan, though he had come along, seemed hardly interested in helping. He looked distracted and kept checking his smartphone. I wanted to yell at him for what he was doing, but we were too busy to bother with that. As time passed, the days rushed by like a storm. After the funeral and memorial services were over, and things had settled down, Hannah came to me and said, "Mom, doesn't Dad seem weird? He's become irritable, and during the funeral, he was so absent and hardly cooperative. Has he been like this recently? Isn't it awful?" Even from my daughter's perspective, Dan's behavior seemed unnatural. Actually, I shared with Hannah about his recent behavior. His late returns had become frequent, and he was going out more on weekends. He often said he was short on money. He was constantly on his smartphone. Hearing this, Hannah frowned. "Mom, that's weird. I'm going to ask him what's going on." It was nice to have her concern, but given Dan's recent behavior, I doubted he would open up even to Hannah. As expected, a while later, Hannah texted me. It didn't work. Dan had insisted to his daughter that work was the reason, and hadn't shared anything else. "Now, I'll look into it myself. You rest, Mom. You must be tired." Hannah spoke kindly, and I felt tears welling up. Indeed, I was exhausted from the shock of my father's death and supporting my mother. I decided to rely on Hannah and take it easy for a while. However, I could only rest for a brief moment. After the funeral, Dan's spending became even more reckless. It seemed the money from the passbook I had given him before wasn't enough, and he started demanding more. "You've already spent it all? That's strange. What exactly are you spending it on? Tell me the truth." When I confronted him, Dan lashed out in response. Shut up. Don't talk back to me. Just give me the money quietly. Dan was shouting with veins bulging in anger. He truly seemed like a different person, and our arguments became more frequent. I thought we had been managing to get along despite having little conversation before. I had never imagined our days could become so tense. I often found myself sighing without even realizing it. I had been feeling down. It was during such times that Hannah came to visit. Mom, I found out why Dad's behavior has changed. Hannah explained to me what she had discovered in her investigation. I was stunned by the truth being uncovered. I couldn't believe it was Dan, of all people. I didn't want to believe it, but faced with undeniable evidence, I was left standing in shock. A while later, on a day after returning from shopping, I found something unfamiliar on the living room table. Upon closer inspection, it was the burned passbook that I had given him when he said he was short of money. What is this? Why? As I murmured, Dan came into the living room. He glared at me and said in a mocking tone, I burned it because I was pissed off. The amount was too small. Give me more. You used to work too, right? At your dead dad's pathetic company? How could you say such awful things? There's no way I can give you money. I could tolerate insults directed at me, but I couldn't stand his derogatory remarks about my father. I was absolutely furious. When I refused, he lost his temper even more. Just give me the money. I need it. Dan was becoming increasingly heated. He was a completely different person now. Seeing him like this, I became strangely calm. I learned a fact that Hannah had told me recently. Need it, you say? To keep your mistress happy, perhaps? I stated it clearly, and Dan was taken aback. Yes, he had been cheating. The details of Hannah's investigation were shocking. I couldn't believe that my serious, devoted husband had fallen for someone else. Apparently, it all started a few months ago when he went to a concert he had been invited to by a junior at his company. That place was a battleground for struggling underground idols. Buying their CDs came with handshake tickets. Hannah speculated that the junior might have wanted Dan to buy the CDs to get those tickets. Essentially, the junior was using him. Unaware, Dan went just to accompany him but ended up falling for one of the underground idols. His infatuation was evident even to an onlooker. Hannah secretly installed a GPS app on Dan's smartphone and followed him. She actually went to the concert venue and saw him obsessed with the idol. Dan was contributing more than anyone else. He frequently visited the concert venue to buy CDs and merchandise. To the idols, he was the perfect mark. He not only collected handshake tickets but also went as far as purchasing hug tickets and one-day date tickets by pouring more money into it. Dan was heavily contributing and secured multiple dating rights. Hannah matched the date scenery the idol posted on SNS with the location data from the GPS app installed on Dan's phone, revealing the truth. This was how he began going on dates with his admired idol. But in the end, wasn't it all about money talking? Surely, she must see him as nothing more than a cash cow. My husband is truly naive. When I pointed out the existence of the mistress, Dan was momentarily shaken, but he quickly defended himself. Yes, that's right. Mandy is someone important to me. The idol, Mandy Irving, was just a 20-year-old girl. Hannah showed me Mandy's social media on her smartphone. Her young face, mismatched with heavy makeup, was striking. There were numerous photos of designer goods and gourmet meals uploaded, with Mandy sporting a smug smile. Actually, on the day of your father's funeral, I was planning to go on a trip with Mandy. Dan finally confessed. I had suspected as much, but I listened to the rest of the story with dismay. The trip had to be cancelled because of my father's funeral. Because of this, Mandy was in a bad mood. Dan said he contributed even more to cheer her up. This time, instead of the convoluted method of date tickets, she directly demanded designer goods. Dan, doing as told, bought everything Mandy desired. Designer bags, cosmetics, and sometimes when she wanted to eat something tasty, he even took her to high-end restaurants. It's all about the money. I spat out, and Dan flew into a rage. Shut up. Unlike you, Mandy has a taste for the finer things. She loves me and doesn't want to leave me. We are in love. That's why I want a divorce. What? I exclaimed in surprise. But he continued without caring about my reaction. Seriously, if your father hadn't died at such a time, I was supposed to go to a fancy hotel with Mandy. It's your fault our fun was ruined. What twisted logic. It's your fault I am unhappy. I'll divorce you and sue for property division. He was howling hysterically. I was at a loss for words. I couldn't believe that the serious and work-devoted Dan had become like this. The shock was great, but from the day Hannah informed me of the truth, my decision was made. I muttered, fed up. Okay. If you insist that much, I understand. We'll divorce. You can have this house, so please enjoy your life with her. Dan looked surprised by my reaction. Really? Yes, really. You can have the house and the car. I'm sick and tired of being manipulated by you. I ignored him and started packing my bags. I had begun preparing a few days earlier, so the packing went surprisingly smoothly. I explained the situation to my mother and decided to take refuge at her house. The next day, I promptly changed the ownership of the house and the car into Dan's name. Actually, both the house and the car were originally in my name. They were purchased with help from my father when his business was doing well. The loans were already paid off. When I informed Dan of the change of ownership, he was pleased. I also filed for divorce. He must think that now that I'm out of the way, he can enjoy his life with Mandy without any worries. How shallow. Little does he know that hell awaits him. Later on, I heard from Hannah, who had gone to scout, that Dan had actually remarried Mandy. They were living in that house. He really married her. Hannah was appalled. No wonder. Her father had remarried someone her age, actually younger. Hannah expressed her disgust, saying, I really can't deal with it. A few days later, I received frantic calls from Dan. Just as I had thought. Oh, what's up? Feigning ignorance, I replied, and Dan began speaking in a grave tone. I'm struggling with taxes, I can't pay them. Indeed, there were inheritance and property taxes associated with the house and the car. Dan had been happy to get the house, but it seemed he had forgotten about the taxes. Well, if it's such a burden, you could just sell it. However, the house, though spacious, had a hidden defect. It had recently been damaged by termites. I had been considering extermination, but I put it on hold due to Dan's commotion. He had no money to hire an exterminator, and without dealing with this, he couldn't sell the house. The car was also in poor condition, nearing the time for a replacement. Dan would not have known that because he usually showed little interest in household matters and rarely used the car. Dan had been all about his work and, since Mandy appeared, only obsessed with his idol, neglecting everything else. I had been the one taking care of those things, but he never noticed, only thinking about himself. Now, the consequences were catching up to him. Dan cursed and hung up the phone. After that, there was no word from him for a while, so I had nearly forgotten about him. Then one day, Hannah came to visit. Mom, actually. It turned out that Dan, now desperate, had sought help from his daughter. He had come to ask her for money. It seems that he decided to continue living in the house with Mandy despite the termite issue. Eventually, swarms of winged termites started emerging from the rotting pillars. Witnessing this horrifying scene, Mandy complained. I can't live in this house. I want to live in a high-rise luxury condo. The car was also an issue. Not satisfied with the nearly broken-down hand-me-down, she was now throwing tantrums for a foreign car. Therefore, unable to back down, Dan decided to take on more debt by borrowing from consumer lenders. Pressured to repay, Dan became completely distressed and even asked Hannah for money. I couldn't forgive him for stooping so low as to ask his own daughter for money. While I was fuming as I listened to Hannah, I noticed the doorbell ringing. Going to check the monitor, I frowned involuntarily. Dan and Mandy were both standing in front of the house. I spoke curtly through the intercom. "What do you want?" "We need to talk about the house, open up." "Please open up. Let's talk." They began speaking loudly and started banging on the door. The noise could disturb the neighbors. Reluctantly, I opened the door and let them in. "So, we want to live in a high-rise condo. We're gathering funds, but we're short, so we need your help." "You owe us that, right?" Dan said smugly. His reasoning was incredibly selfish. Was he not aware of how unreasonable he was being? Even after being turned down by Hannah, he had the audacity to come and beg me. Hannah looked at them with disdain. Seeing Mandy in person for the first time was an experience. I had only seen her heavily edited photos on social media, but up close, she just looked like a country girl trying to hide behind makeup and colored contacts. Mandy spoke in a clingy voice. "You're the ex-wife, right? I want to live in a lovely home with Dan. We were hoping you could give us some money for that. But just a little, okay? Dan told me you're poor." Saying that, she laughed mockingly. How could Dan fall for such a woman? Perhaps his lack of experience with women was now backfiring. Although Mandy pretended to be all lovey-dovey, she subtly kept her distance from him. Clearly, she was only after his money and didn't even want to touch the older man. Meanwhile, Dan, eager to make contact, casually reached out to touch her, but Mandy easily avoided him. Watching their interaction, Hannah and I couldn't help but burst into laughter. Dan, enthralled by a greedy woman, appeared pitifully absurd, yet he spoke arrogantly, oblivious to his plight. "I know what's going on. Your dad passed away and left you an inheritance, right? Hand it over. It might be a meager amount, but it's better than nothing." I expected such remarks. Dan thought my father's company was a small, failing business, and he believed I only received a modest part-time salary for my work there. How little interest had he shown in me? I sighed. "Father's inheritance?" "Oh, I inherited about $3 million. Both were dumbfounded by the amount. When we married, my father's company was doing well. The house and the car were purchased under my name with financial assistance from my father. Dan's salary from a small to medium-sized business wasn't enough to buy a house in this area. However, after falling ill, my father could no longer work energetically, and he had been reducing his workload. His death came just as he was planning to retire and spend more time with my mother. Dan simply assumed that the decrease in work meant financial troubles. My father was a planner. Knowing he was ill, he must have arranged his affairs and prepared to wind down the company. He left an inheritance for my mother and me. But you know, I can't just give away my parents' inheritance. It's decided by law. Their eyes widened at my words. Even if I could, I wouldn't give you anything. Both of you are the worst kind of people. Dan, who squanders without caring for his family, and Mandy, who can think only of squeezing money out of others. And to think you dared insult my late father. I can't forgive that. I never want to see your faces again. Get out now." As I spoke clearly, Dan glared at me and said, "What did you say?" Mandy also looked at me sharply. The two slowly stood up. Just as Dan was about to raise his hand towards me, a siren sounded nearby. I called the police. "Go ahead, do something to my mom, and you'll be arrested." Hannah, clutching her smartphone, shouted just in time. Dan and Mandy looked at each other, pale-faced, then bolted out the door. The aftermath for the two was tragic. From the grapevine, it seems that Dan, unable to pay any longer, resorted to borrowing from loan sharks. He quickly became trapped in a cycle of high-interest debt. Naturally, trying to satisfy Mandy's endless desires would exhaust any amount of money. Soon, they couldn't even repay the money borrowed from the loan sharks, and collectors began showing up at their house. While legitimate businesses prohibit illegal collection practices, Loan sharks are composed of outlaws who don't adhere to such standards. Ultimately, Dan was overwhelmed by the relentless collections that came day and night. Mandy quickly divorced him after abandoning him, who had desperately tried to keep her. By then, he had no money left to keep her, and he even struggled to afford daily meals. Dan eventually opted for bankruptcy. His home was auctioned off. Of course, in such a state, he couldn't focus on his job and was soon fired. Homeless and frightened of the loan sharks, he was rumored to be living in hostels. Meanwhile, Mandy resumed her idle activities as if nothing had happened, clearly looking for a new financial source. However, her inherently greedy nature was all too apparent, and her popularity dwindled to nothing. Her concerts drew no crowds, and her social media was bombarded with comments like "Gold digger" and "Greedy ugly." Eventually, she quietly stopped updating, and her social media accounts were deleted, signaling the end of her idle activities. That's probably for the best. People who act solely to satisfy their own greed and not to bring joy to others do not deserve to be idols. I am now taking over my father's business. It was a company my father had planned to close, but after discussing it with my mother, I began to think that there might still be something I could do. My father always thought of me and supported me. Though he has passed away, I want to contribute something to him in return. With that in mind, I have started to learn little by little about the business. Since I originally worked in accounting while my father was alive, I understand some aspects of management. My mother supports me, and we now employ a few part-timers. Work has become the most enjoyable thing for me. Hannah has also successfully found a job and has become a working adult. She says she will treat my mother and me soon. I am truly glad she has become such a respectable adult. At one point, I wondered what would become of us, but we have somehow managed to regain a stable life. I believe that as long as we, as a family, work together, we can overcome anything. I gently look at the portrait of my father. His smile is as gentle as ever. I thought, "Please watch over us, Dad." I gently smile back at my father.